Hello YouTube. Today I'll tell you more about Kamchatka. It's a very interesting part of Russia, and it's part of the Russian Far East. I would say this territory is not really explored, the whole Far East, and it contains a lot of paranormal secrets. It's a beautiful part of Russia, and for centuries it has been full of very unexplained phenomena. And the local people too, the indigent people of the territories, they have their own stories. But today I do want to go back to Kamchatka. And so that you know, this is a peninsula that has over 100,000 large and small lakes. Again, largely unexplored. There have been very interesting UFO sightings through the years. But I'll tell you today about unidentified submersible objects and the possible underwater USO bases in Kamchatka, and also about those who search for answers. At the end of my video, I will also warn you about something regarding Kamchatka. I'll be as detailed as possible. You know my research, and I do want to tell you as much as I can about the territory and what's been going on, because very few people in this world realize where Kamchatka is, and especially what's going on there. Like this case from 1938, which was reported by a Soviet geologist whose last name was Solovyov. He was a scientist in the Kamchatka volcano research expedition. In May of 1938, he and his colleague Melnikov made their long trek through the Kamchatka wilds, 400 kilometers without any roads, through the swamps, rivers and marshes. They carry on. Finally, the geologists encountered Lake Big Kaligir. They had to go waist deep in the water, bypassing the hanging tops of alder trees. The weather was unusually sunny. The water in the lake was completely calm. Quite close to them, the geologists saw frequent splashing of large fish. Now, Big Kaligir Lake is 130 kilometers from Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, the main city in Kamchatka. Of course, it's a very unusual, very interesting lake. Great place to fish as well. Now, Solovyov, he walked first, and somewhere in the middle of the way, he saw a steep cliff, near which the alder trees did not grow. There was a cave in the rock. After thinking that it will be possible to dry and relax there, he headed to the shore. Bending down, the geologist entered that cave, but when he raised his head, he saw that the whole cave was flooded with water. Deep inside the cave, Solovyov found a rocky black island, in the middle of which was a bright white glow. It was pouring out. The geologist spent about 2 minutes looking at that strange glow, and when he heard the footsteps of his colleague Melnikov, he looked back and he was plunged into complete darkness. Solovyov realized he was blind. Falling on his hands in the water, he cried out, "Nikolai, help, I can't see anything." Melnikov, picking up his colleague under the arms, dragged him to the exit. They had to go again waist deep in the water, more than a kilometer, and Melnikov carried his comrade on his shoulders. They were resting on a dry shore among undersized birch trees for a long time. Solovyov could not see anything. Nikolai, as he could, tried to reassure him, saying, "It will pass, everything will be fine, you'll see again." And indeed, after 10 hours, his colleague began to discern some swiftly, jumping white, green and yellow spots. In an hour, he had some pink veil in his eyes. The sun was descending, sunset fell, and for the first time in many hours of darkness, the geologist saw clouds, then the tops of the birch trees, and the friend who saved him. Many years have passed since that day. Senior Lieutenant Nikolai Melnikov died during the World War II, fighting against Nazi invaders near Leningrad. He told Solovyov that he also had seen that radiance, that glow, but not for long, just for a few seconds. And apparently this circumstance saved him from temporary blindness. Unfortunately, Solovyov was not able to visit the big Kaligir lake again, although the thought of the mysterious radiance for many years was on his mind. All the experts he consulted for clarification had no answers. No one has yet been able to answer the question, what was it? What blinded him? What did he see in that cave? So in 1976, Solovyov decided to write about the case of blinding light to the magazine Technika Молодежи. This is a cool magazine. In the darkest hours of Soviet regime, you could find stories talking about UFOs and what we could call paranormal phenomena to an extent in that magazine. I mean, there was censorship, but those editors in charge of this magazine were quite brave. And I remember as a teenager, I learned a lot of stuff, pushed my interest because I was really interested in UFOs and paranormal phenomena. Anyway, his letter, Solovyov's letter, was published, and it caused a stream of responses from former residents of Kamchatka, and that's where it gets interesting. It turned out that on the shore of the lake once stood a fishing village Kaligir, built on the site of the local indigenous settlement Kinat. Long before the war it was abandoned. The locals knew about the cave and were afraid to approach it. In the early 1920s, a small cavalry detachment from the remnants of the defeated anti-communist army of Admiral Kolchak came to the site. Those troops heard stories about the strange cave and decided that there are hidden treasures inside, and sinister rumors about it were disseminated by local people to discourage those who wanted to get the gold. So the White Guards, as the Soviets called their enemies, left to look for the treasures in the cave, and nothing was heard from them for a few days. Then one of the White Guards staggered into the village. He was ragged and lost. The soldier was clearly disturbed. He muttered something about the fire in which the comrades burned. The face and hands of the unfortunate man were covered with blisters. Locals tried to cure him, but in a few days the soldier died in terrible agony. His rather light burns and wounds could not be the cause of death. So the White Guard soldier died from something else. So I wanted to find out more about the strange lake. And that time I already had quite a lot of information about Kamchatka to the extent possible. And the strange underwater object that was sighted there in 1970. We'll get to that. But let's continue with the lake Kaligir at this point. Some information arrived from Russia years ago. There was an expedition to the lake in 1980, and it was organized and headed by none other than Valery Dvuzhilny, biologist, scientist, and ufologist. He was also with the Far Eastern branch of the Russian Geographical Society. This was the same scientist who in 1986 was the first one to study the Dalnygorsk UFO crash. And I urge you to look at my video about this tremendously important story that should not be forgotten and should be researched more. But again, this is part of the wonderful paranormal phenomena that exist in the Far East. Now, Dvuzhilny found Solovyov, the geologist who sent his letter about the 1938 events to Technika Молодежи magazine. He invited the geologist to join Dvuzhilny and his friends or colleagues for the expedition. But Solovyov could not, because the expedition did not procure a helicopter, and at his age the geologist would not be able to walk in the water waist deep. The expedition consisted of 5 people, and they boarded the motor ship and arrived in Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky on August the 3rd. There it turned out that there is no permanent communication with the Kaligir district. So the border guards sent the expedition participants along on a passing vessel. When their ship was already passing by the Bay of Kaligir, the captain said that no one is going to disembark. That's the water, how deep it was. It was too shallow. Only after many arguments and reminders about the orders of the superiors, the captain relented and launched a boat. His concerns were justified. Near the shore, the boat caught on the cliff and it pierced the bottom. Russian geographers had to jump into the water. Fortunately, on the shore, there was a fisherman's hut with a stove, and it was marked on the map that they had possessed. The first day, scientists spent in the hut, prepared the food, and checked their equipment. The next day, it was on August 7, their itinerary was to go to the right shore of the lake. Solovyev knew what he was saying. The shore was so overgrown with alder that they had to walk only knee deep in the water. The explorers dragged with them on a rope a rubber boat loaded with tent, sleeping bags, and food products. Valery Dvuzhilny repeatedly turned on radiation measuring device, dosimeter, but it showed a normal radiation background. Soon everyone realized that there was no caves of natural origin there, except for some grottos made by waves, through the centuries. If the cave that Solovyev described existed, then somebody had to carve it out. Dead fish with walleyes and inflated backs were found all over the shore. Now the live fish hardly battered or moved in the water, staring with blind eyes. Seagulls did not try to peck their light prey, keeping away from the water. So what happened? It could not have been an emission of poisonous gases. Salmon, cham, and dog and red salmon fish varieties swam through the lake to spawn in a normal fashion. The dosimeter showed only 25-30 micro-Röntgen readings per hour. The dead fish was killed by some powerful short-term burst of energy, temporarily turning the lake bowl into a deadly trap. Dvuzhilny later recalled that the evening was approaching and the expedition passed only 1.5 kilometers. Going any further in the dark made no sense. So they put up the tent, prepared the sleeping bags, and began to prepare dinner. After the meal, the explorers sat down by the campfire, dried their clothes, and shared impressions of the day. At 10 o'clock in the evening, on the opposite shore of the lake, there was a strong rumble and rattle. It came from the bottom, not from the surface. A blue glow erupted, and they heard a strong splash, similar to the surfacing of a huge body from under the water, a huge object. After some time, 8 huge waves rolled to their shore. The boat jumped several times on the waves. It became clear something huge popped out of the water, but what was it exactly? Dvuzhilny was engulfed by a monstrous force of inexplicable fear. He wanted to throw himself on the mountain and run up. The fear was inexplicable, animalistic. With a huge effort, the explorers remained on the spot and did not rush everywhere just to escape. After the object popped up from the bottom of the lake and disappeared, their fear quickly passed. And then a yellow dot flared up over the water of the adjacent shore. After 2 or 3 seconds above it appeared a large blue hemisphere with a radius about 30 to 50 meters, rising above the crown of the trees. This was repeated several times at intervals of 5 minutes. First the yellow dot, then the blue dot hemisphere. The dots were not very bright, but the hemisphere seemed bright and dense. The shore was not seen through it. The cameras were available, but no one thought to take a picture. Later, the expedition members justified their actions because that black and white Soviet film anyway could not capture the unprecedented spectacle. The next day, at the location where they saw the mysterious hemisphere, most of the dead fish was found. Perhaps there was a connection between the blinded stickleback fish and the object's departure. In a lake that is 90 meters deep, you can hide anything. The explorers looked at the place where the object from the water was approximately ascending, but did not see anything interesting. Vilyuchinsk said that the third day of exploring the lake was over and the results was zero. The west bay of the lake they carefully viewed in binoculars. There are steep slopes of mountains and no signs of a cave. The explorers were utterly worn out by the endless transitions. Their food products were almost gone. There was little time left. They had to board a fishing vessel, but it never arrived. The Russian geographers had to go through the taiga boreal forest for 3 days to get to the Zhupanov Cape, where the fishing boats visited regularly. So they decided to come back the next year. They prepared expedition Kaligir 81 much more carefully. At the disposal of scientists were inflatable raft with an engine, scuba, portable compressor for filling cylinders, and a whole barrel of gasoline. In a few days, the group used a motorized raft to explore the entire perimeter of the lake, especially carefully inspecting the South Bay, but that cave was not found. Maybe the cave was now hidden underwater after a powerful earthquake frequented the peninsula. There's so many volcanoes on Kamchatka. The expedition, just in case, explored the neighboring lakes, which was smart. The small Kaligir, large and small Medveshka, but also they didn't find any even hints of a cave entrance. If the cave really has gone underwater, it could be found using the sonar to explore the bottom and the shore. The sonar would not only find the entrance under the water, but would also check if there are any strange constructions, structures at the bottom deep below of the lake. The participants of the next expedition would need heavy diving suits without face covering glass. They could see what is happening outside only through video cameras with protective filters to protect the vision of the divers from blinding light and their bodies from baneful deadly flame. This, of course, would be very expensive. But there were no more expeditions. The Soviet Union was losing its aging leaders. The Soviet economy was really bad, and the war in Afghanistan was not going well at all. Some years later, there was no more Soviet Union. Vilyuchinsk was busy exploring the Dalnygorsk case and other fascinating finds in the far eastern provinces, and he made good connections with the local Russian army. But I've covered it in other videos about the Far East. He passed away in 2014. Vilyuchinsk. He was a great scientist and explorer. But now I need to tell you about another of Kamchatka's lakes. Lake Kranotskaya, the largest lake in Kamchatka, is situated in the Intermountain Depression. A chain of 16 volcanoes rests along the Kranotskaya Lake. The highest of them is the Dome of the Kranotskaya. It's about 33,528 meters above the sea level. In the year of 1970, a group of hydrologists had conducted their research at the lake aboard a motorboat. Valentin Psalomshikov, while attending the Leningrad Hydrometeorological Institute, was acquainted with another student whose last name was Agarkov. I could not find his first name, and I've asked people who know and live in Kamchatka. In 1970, Agarkov already graduated from that institute. He was engaged in the ocean research and headed the hydrological expedition at the Kranotskaya Lake. So the depth of the lake was over 100 meters. It was a pleasant August day. All of a sudden, at a distance of about a kilometer from where the scientists worked, a dome of rising water was formed, and a gray-colored oval object flew from it. The UFO was about 40 to 60 meters in size. It ascended to the altitude of a few hundred meters. to 70 to 80 degrees to the horizon, and it hovered motionlessly. Russian hydrologists remained stunned for about a minute and a half, and the motorboat's engine it stalled, and then they started rowing. The UFO began moving rapidly away and disappeared from the view at great speed. The boat's motor again started working right then. Later, Agarkov reported that the next year, 2 of the 4 eyewitnesses of the UFO sighting perished under very strange circumstances. This sighting was mentioned in the 2001 article written by Valentin Psalomshikov, a very distinguished journalist and scientist in Russia. And it was published in the NLO magazine. But the author also revealed that there have been other tragic incidents of close encounters with the unidentified submersible objects. That's what happened at the other lake. Until 1991, you need to know, Kamchatka was so-called closed territory. To get there from other parts of the Soviet Union, you need to have special papers. The reason was presence of a special settlement, which was known to the locals as Petropavlovsk 50, and the United States intelligence services and the NATO intelligence services, and probably China, knew it as the wasp's nest. Vilyuchinsk, it's the port harbor city in Kamchatka, and it's still considered to be closed territorial administrative unit. This is where the Russian Pacific Navy is based. During the Cold War, there were so many Soviet submarines at the base, and many of them departed for the American shores, that the Americans called Vilyuchinsk the wasp's nest. So that you know, Kamchatka has many Russian military personnel. There's another interesting place in Kamchatka. It was called Buchta or Bay Finval or Bechevinka. It's now a forgotten and abandoned, I should say, base of the Russia's Navy, which is basically like a horror movie if you go there and look what's there. There was a garrison which was built in 1960s as a military settlement for the submariners, and the submarine division stayed there until 1996, but then they were moved to another place called Zavoyko. So the unit that was in charge of that base was disbanded, and a lot of equipment was taken out. There was no more water or electricity left, no more utilities, and the settlement ended its existence. However, something is going on there. Probably not anything official, but people have talked about strange, unusual events at that abandoned submarine territory. There's also another place on Kamchatka, very unusual. It's called the Valley of Death. It's deadly for anything that comes along. It's an anomalous area, and they only found this area back in the 1970s of the 20th century. It's not from the Kikhpitych volcano next to the Geyser River. It's about 2 meters long and just a few meters, I would say a few hundred meters probably wide, and it doesn't like uninvited guests. Anything living that gets into that area usually perishes and dies a very painful death a day or 2 after they leave the anomalous area. The birds who come here, the animals who come here by mistake, the birds who fly there, they die. And there are many corpses of animals all around. Now the scientists could not figure out what's going on with this quick death. Now they think it's because of the very powerful and concentrated poisonous gases which come from under the water. There are other interesting and strange places in Kamchatka. If you want to travel there, it's a beautiful piece of earth. But you need to know, food is very expensive. There's almost no infrastructure. But ecologically, it's like one of the best places on earth. However, Wi-Fi is not good, internet is very expensive, but people go there if they can afford to because of the weather and the climate, more or less climate, and ecology is very high. But there are no roads, again, very poor infrastructure. For Russian military, there are no problems. They get high pay, and there's more of them on that peninsula than maybe in some other parts of Russia. And I told you about other areas not too far away of the Far East, on the Kuril Islands, where the Russian military is very active, because something is going there. And I have to tell you about Sakhalin also, the island of Sakhalin, but later, because there are other developments. So the Russian army is very active in the area. And of course, this is the base of the Navy. It's hard to travel on the peninsula during the winter. The snow is very deep and very dense, and in the summertime it's hard to travel because there are no roads and the bears are very aggressive. The best time to come to Kamchatka is in the summer. That's what people say. But you need to know that there are winds and fog, and it's not easy for some. But the water is fresh, the air is fresh, thermal springs, fresh fish, caviar, and people do skiing, those who can. Those who land in the Yelizevo airport, they will never forget the beautiful view that comes to them. It's hard to describe, you have to see it. It's one of the most beautiful places around. Winters are long again and windy, and there's a lot of snow. There is no spring per se, just short period between winter and the summer. And again, people say summer is the best time. I don't remember at this point. It was many years for me ago. But the autumn is very nice. So my warning to you is this: go if you want to explore Kamchatka. If you want to do good fishing. It's an interesting area in the paranormal sense, but there's a lot of secrecy, and places are very hard to get to, and you might trip on a government secret which you should not do, because the Russian military doesn't play jokes. Definitely there is something in the lakes of Kamchatka, and maybe someday we will find out. Just as about secrets of other nearby territories, and then we spread into Siberia, Central Asia, and so forth. But that's what's exciting about Russia. It's a huge land, thousands of years of history, and there are so many UFO encounters and reports, and of course USOs. And I'll tell you as much as I can. Thank you. Please subscribe to my videos and share them.